This is our first grammar lecture. In particular, this lecture is going to be focusing on the different parts of speech. So to begin with, we really want to consider what are the parts of speech and why do they matter, especially for grammar. So if you think about the parts of speech, they're really the building blocks of language. They're the different word types that we use in order to construct a sentence, that we use to construct a paragraph, and then building, of course, to our overall essay. So it's really important to know the different parts of speech because by knowing them, we can better revise and make sure that each sentence we're creating is as clear as possible and that each word is serving a purpose in creating that specific meaning. We have many different parts of speech that function in very different ways. We have nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and articles, which we're going to be talking about today. The first part of speech that we're going to talk about is the noun. The noun is one of the most important types of parts of speech, primarily because nouns are necessary for sentences. If we think of types of nouns, we have nouns that represent people, represent places, represent things, as well as ideas or concepts like integrity, freedom, religion. So really when we think about nouns, nouns are important to know because usually nouns form the subjects of our sentences because of course our sentences are saying something about that person or something about that place or something about that thing or even something about that idea, but nouns also work as the object of a sentence or completing an action, they're really adding that clarity. And of course, depending on the noun, we do have a difference when it comes to proper nouns. So proper nouns are the specific name of a person, place, or thing, or idea. So when you think about your first name and your last name, that would be a proper noun. So we would always capitalize the first letter of a proper noun to indicate that it's your proper name, that it's your specific name, separate from you just being a person. So if we really want to think about it for nouns, proper nouns are more specific titles, while just the normal nouns are more generalizations about what something is. We also want to consider titles like mom or dad to be proper nouns when they're being used as a name of the person, so in place of their actual proper name. So for example, if we have a sentence like, Mom told me to go to the store to buy eggs for my dad's breakfast, Mom would always be capitalized even if it is not at the beginning of the sentence. However, if we notice my dad's breakfast, it's not capitalized because of that use of my. So by making it possessive of dad, you're not referring to him by that title as if it was his name. You're just identifying that relationship, which is why it's not capitalized. Pronouns as a part of speech are really important because they really help us to avoid repetition in our sentences. Because pronouns function in order to replace or refer to a noun, so you're not just saying it over and over again. So when we think of pronouns, we have different types of pronouns. We have a subject pronoun, which is the subject of a sentence. So these types of pronouns specifically can have verbs attached to them. So the pronoun can be completing some type of action. Typically, we would never end a sentence with a subject pronoun. As a good rule of thumb, you should always have a verb right after the subject pronoun to make sure that it's being used properly. On the other hand, object pronouns, those are pronouns that are typically presented at the end of a sentence. So the subject and the verb are referring then to the object. So as a rule of thumb for that, we don't typically have a verb after that object pronoun. Possessive adjective pronouns, those are used to show ownership of another noun. So for instance, if I were to have a sentence, that is my cat, I'm emphasizing my ownership of that cat separate from the cat itself. So if you think about it, my is working as an adjective to clarify that ownership of that animal. So with possessive pronouns, which is our next type of pronoun, it shows ownership, but it isn't used before a noun. So in this case, what I am owning is the subject of the sentence. So the cat is mine. It gives me variety in terms of how I can say the same thing. And then, of course, lastly, we have reflexive pronouns, which are used when the subject and object of a sentence are the same. This typically means that we are mirroring each other. So I believe in myself. So I believe I'm completing that action, and then I'm still the object of that sentence. So really it's important to pay attention to the usage of the pronouns because of course they differ depending on if you're referring to or replacing a singular or plural noun. So of course if I were to have the sentence I believe in myself, it doesn't really work the same if I were to say I believe in ourselves, because then I'm turning myself into a plural. It kind of makes me sound like I have multiple personalities, which of course can confuse the reader. So when we're thinking about the building blocks of sentences specifically, the ones that we want to pay the most attention to moving forward as we're working on our first essay are, of course, nouns and subject pronouns. Because, of course, the building block of sentences, every sentence needs to have a subject. So if we can identify if the subject is a noun or a subject pronoun, that can go a long way in us figuring out if we're using complete sentences, and so that we can revise them if we're not and make them as clear as possible. Which brings us to our next part of speech, which is the verb, another really important part of speech to be aware of in checking that we have complete sentences, because for a sentence to be complete, it needs to have some type of action. A good way of making sure that we don't have any fragments in our writing is looking for at least one verb. So if we think of verbs, those are words that indicate the action or state of being. So types of verbs, we have action verbs. So those are typically simpler. So I think, I run, I skate, I play. They're actions that you can complete. So if we're thinking of identifying a verb, you can ask yourself, is this verb something I could do? If it's not, then it's either not a verb or it's not an action verb. Next, we have helping verbs. Helping verbs are when we have more than one verb working together to create the meaning of the sentence. So if we really think about it, they're working to help the action verb be more clear. So I can run. That's saying that I am not running, but I can complete that action if I choose to. So if we think about it, it's really changing how that verb functions. And lastly, we have state of being verbs. So these ones are a little bit different because state of being verbs, they're not necessarily actions you can complete. They're just verbs that indicate that your existence is the emphasis of that sentence. So if we think of state of being verbs, that's really the emphasis of to be. Most languages have a to be verb function. In the case of English language, we have I am or I was, or we are, we were. Second person, we have you are, you were. So if we think about it, that to be, whenever we have a form of this verb at the beginning of a sentence, typically that is the main verb of the sentence. That can really help us narrow down what we should be focusing on. For parts of speech, prepositions are a little bit trickier because they do serve multiple functions within different sentence types. So we're going to talk a lot more about prepositions later in this semester once we get into prepositional phrases as well as infinitives. But for prepositions, the gist is they work with a noun or pronoun in order to locate the noun in time or space or make it more specific or clear. So we have prepositions that indicate position. So if we think of that, it's relative to the position of one thing to another, or if we think about it, position of an action. So I walked towards the door, it's indicating where specifically I am walking. We have prepositions that indicate time. So before class, I ordered a coffee. So I'm indicating I completed this action before a specific time. Then we have oddball prepositions like of, with, for, concerning, about, except, but, like, and as. So they're odd because they can fulfill multiple purposes. So if we think of I went to dinner with friends, so it's adding the additional information to the sentence instead of adding addition and locating something in time and space. When we have prepositions made up of two or more words, so according to, prior to, in front of, as to, these typically are the beginning of prepositional phrases or even introductory phrases, so we can use them in the beginning of sentences. Our next part of speech is the conjunction. So conjunctions are really important, especially as we get into our different sentence types, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So it's important to know that conjunctions are ways of joining or connecting different ideas, clauses, or parts of a sentence. When we think about conjunctions, we do have this acronym FANBOYS, which really breaks down the different conjunction options we have. It's important to know the differences though, because based on which conjunction we're using, it really changes the relationship between what we're connecting within that sentence. The first fanboy is for. So for serves a similar purpose as because. It indicates a causal relationship within the sentence that's connecting to the two independent clauses. We have the example, I told her to leave for I was very tired. So if we think of that, we can substitute for with because, and then it would be I told her to leave because I was very tired. And then now we can see that they do have the same meaning, and it can give us the variety so we're not saying because over and over again. Our next conjunction, and probably the most frequently used, is and, which we use for listing. So we use and to indicate the end of a list as we're listing the different ideas or different points we're making. We also use and to list sentences, and that's what turns into a compound sentence. So for example, we have I like football and I like hockey. One thing that you really want to know is you cannot begin a sentence with and, especially in academic writing, because you're not listing in that case. Our next one, and probably one of the least commonly used conjunctions, is nor. So this indicates that neither option or part to the sentence is true or viable. For instance, I've neither done the dishes nor the laundry. So essentially it's negating both of those actions. Our next conjunction is but, which is another of the most commonly used conjunctions. It presents an unexpected or unfortunate outcome or result. So for instance, we have our sentence, she's 85, but she still goes swimming every day. So essentially it's saying that this person, the subject, is 85, so we would not expect her to go swimming every day. Or that is when we're choosing between the two sentences or two options. So either they both can't be true or you can't have both. For example, I will eat either a burger or a hot dog. So it's saying I have to eat one of the or the other. I cannot have both. And I cannot have neither one. We have yet, which is very similar to using but. However, it emphasizes that relationship a lot more. For example, the weather was cold yet bright and sunny. So if we think about it, the connotation is a lot more positive. So it's emphasizing that unexpected result in that positive way. And finally, our last conjunction is so. So this can be used in place of therefore. It presents the results of something, very much opposite to because. So in this case, we have our example. It was still painful, so I went to see a doctor. So if we think of that, changing that, we can say it was still painful, therefore I went to see a doctor. And we can see how they both have the same meaning. However, we can get variety by using so instead of therefore or vice versa. The next part of speech is an adjective. Adjectives work to modify a noun or pronoun, and in most cases, they work to describe that noun or pronoun in some way, or make them a little bit more descriptive. For example, adjectives work to answer which one, how many, what color, what kind. They really give a lot more visceral visual details to the sentence. We have different types. We have the descriptive adjective, like the bright fuchsia, fragrant flower. Those are describing the noun being the flower. Then we have nominal adjectives, which are making the sentence more specific. So the flower petal is damaged. So it's clarifying, in this case, that the petal belongs to the flower, or what type of petal is damaged. Lastly, we have the present or past participles without a helping verb. So, for example, the wilted flower, the glistening petals. So, if we notice, in this case, the adjective ends in ed or ing. So, it gives the noun, in this case, flower or petals, more action, which, of course, is, in the case of the wilted flower, the past action. And then, of course, the glistening petals is more present. Adverbs as a part of speech serve a very similar function as adjectives. However, instead of modifying a noun, adverbs modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. So in this case, a lot of adverbs end in ly. And of course, they answer the when, where, why, and how. We also have other types of adverbs that add commentary to the action, so still, never, rather, almost, quietly, or amazingly. So, for example, we have he suddenly opened the door, he did not knock. Suddenly is describing the action of opening the door. He did not knock is also describing the action of knocking. And our final part of speech is the article. So articles precede a noun in a sentence. So in particular, when we use articles, they make the noun more specific or broad, depending on the article we're using. And articles, we do have very few options. We have a, which implies that the noun is one of many, or you're just talking about one. So for example, I want to adopt a dog. So if we notice that I'm just wanting to adopt one dog. However, it's one of many dogs I could adopt, or it also doesn't necessarily say I don't have other dogs. In a very similar way, we have an, which has the exact same meaning of a, the same usage as a. However, we use an instead when the noun becomes with a vowel. This is important when it comes to reading the sentence, so it helps make the separation between the article and the noun more clear and easier to read. For example, I went to the store to buy an apple for lunch versus I went to the store to buy a apple for lunch. You can hear how an apple has more of an enunciation, therefore it makes it more clear when you're hearing it. And our final article is the, which makes the noun you're referring to be more specific or emphasizing its importance. So the bandit was afraid of being caught by the cops. So if you think about the bandit, it's clarifying that you're talking about this specific bandit. There may be other bandits, but you're only doing or focusing on this one. And of course, the cops is emphasizing the cops, not a cop or by cops. So it's really changing the flow of that sentence. So as I mentioned before, it is really important to become familiar with these parts of speech because, of course, the more we are familiar with them, the better it can help us through our revision process. And of course, it makes it easier for us to check for run-on sentences or fragments and really make sure that our sentences are as clear as possible.